The day started in chaos. A power outage had reset our alarm clock, leaving my wife, Melanie, and me scrambling to catch up with our morning routine. My stress was mild in comparison to hers. She had an earlier start, while my workday didn't begin until 9 a.m. and my office was only a short 15-minute drive away. In her rush, Melanie skipped her usual routine of checking emails and left her computer running. As I went to shut it down, a subject line from a few days earlier caught my eye: "Aloha for a great time." Instinctively, I clicked it open, and what I found inside hit me like a freight train. It was an email outlining Melanie's secret plan to escape to Hawaii with another man during my upcoming 2-week business trip. I felt an icy twist deep in my stomach. Let me back up and give you the background. Melanie and I met through mutual friends about a decade ago. Our connection was instant, thanks to our shared love for the outdoors and a healthy lifestyle. Melanie, a fitness instructor, was passionate about yoga and wellness. I, on the other hand, was more career-focused, working as an IT consultant. Whenever I had time, I'd join her in hiking or running, and we complemented each other well. For 8 years, I thought we were happy, at least, I was. But now, staring at the email, everything I believed about our marriage shattered. The email mentioned a man named Jason, someone I'd never heard about before. They had been seeing each other for months, and she had everything planned down to the smallest detail. I felt betrayed, furious, but more than anything, I needed answers. I dug through Melanie's inbox, discovering folder after folder of messages exchanged between her and Jason. The affair had been ongoing for about 6 months, and I couldn't understand why she had done this. Our life had seemed perfect, or so I thought. As I read each damning email, my initial shock turned into cold, calculated anger. Before leaving for work, I copied the emails onto a thumb drive. I needed time to process this bombshell and, more importantly, time to figure out who Jason was and why Melanie would betray me like this. But I wasn't just going to confront her, I was going to take action. At first, I thought about confronting her directly. However, after simmering on it for a day, I decided to get creative. Instead of going straight for a face-off, I came up with a different plan, a plan where I would destroy their little getaway and humiliate Jason in the process. I was going to make sure Melanie felt the weight of her betrayal without her ever seeing it coming. I knew I needed more information, so I did some digging. Jason wasn't just some random guy, he worked with Melanie at the fitness center, and according to what I learned, he was a bit of a player, notorious for getting involved with married women. That just added fuel to my fire. The plan I devised was simple but effective. First, I would frame Jason for something that would make sure his plans with Melanie never saw the light of day. I spent the next few days gathering information, preparing, and setting the stage. One evening, I casually asked Melanie about our car insurance paperwork, an innocent question that gave me access to the documents I needed. With those, I carefully set up the next step. Jason was about to be framed for stealing my car. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Using a spare set of keys and some manipulation, I made it look as though Jason had stolen my car from our driveway. I called the police, reporting the theft, and gave them enough details to get Jason temporarily arrested. I even arranged for Jason to be spotted near our home, tipping off a neighbor who saw him suspiciously walking by our house a few days earlier. It all fit perfectly. With Jason arrested and their Hawaii trip ruined, I felt a twisted satisfaction. But I wasn't done yet. I still had Melanie to deal with. A few days later, she mentioned that she had a friend in some trouble and needed to go help. I kept my face neutral, pretending to be supportive, but inside I was seething. I knew exactly who she was rushing off to see and exactly why she was so panicked. When Melanie finally returned home, I calmly asked her about her day. She lied through her teeth, telling me she had been visiting her sister. That's when I knew it was time for the final confrontation. "Are you sure you were at your sister's?" I asked casually, watching her closely. Her face went pale, and she stammered, what do you mean? I pulled out the thumb drive with the emails. I know about you and Jason. I know everything. Her reaction was a mixture of shock and horror. She tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was undeniable. And when I told her about Jason's arrest, her face fell. She knew I had beaten her at her own game. There was no screaming, no crying, just a cold, final conversation where I told her I wanted a divorce. I didn't care about her excuses or apologies. The trust had been broken, and there was no going back. After I told Melanie I wanted a divorce, she sat there in stunned silence. I had expected more from her, a burst of emotion, maybe even anger, but she seemed more in shock that her perfect little affair had unraveled so quickly. Her face told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't sorry for what she did, she was just sorry she got caught. Is this how it ends? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at her, a woman I had loved for years, now a stranger sitting across from me. It ended the moment you decided to betray me, I said coldly. You had a choice, Melanie. You could have talked to me, worked through whatever issues you had. But you didn't. Instead, you planned a romantic getaway with someone else and left me in the dark. Her eyes welled up with tears, but they felt hollow. I didn't want to hurt you, she murmured, as though that would make any difference. Well, you did, I said flatly. And now, it's over. I didn't wait for her to respond. I stood up and walked out of the room, my heart heavy but resolute. I wasn't about to let her drag me into another round of apologies and excuses. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. Over the next few weeks, I set the wheels of the divorce in motion. I made sure to document everything, the emails, the evidence of her affair, and the fact that Jason had been arrested on suspicion of stealing my car. It was a carefully crafted plan, and now that it had all come to fruition, I felt a strange sense of relief. Melanie moved out shortly after I filed the divorce papers. We agreed to keep things civil, no messy courtroom battles or dragging it out for years. She didn't try to fight me on much, which made things easier. Maybe she was too ashamed to make it more difficult, or maybe she just wanted to be free of the guilt. Either way, I didn't care. I wanted her gone. In the weeks following her departure, I went through a whirlwind of emotions. Some days, I felt liberated, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Other days, I found myself drowning in bitterness. How could the woman I had trusted with my heart for so many years betray me so completely? One night, I sat in the quiet of my now empty home, the echoes of our past life together still lingering in the walls. I picked up the glass of whiskey on the table and stared into it, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Was it my fault? Had I been too focused on my career, neglecting her needs? I couldn't help but wonder if there was something I could have done to prevent all of this. But deep down, I knew the answer. Melanie had made her choice. This wasn't about me failing her, it was about her failing us. A few months after the dust settled, I learned that Jason had been released after the charges were dropped. Apparently, they couldn't prove he had stolen my car. I wasn't surprised, I had made sure the evidence was flimsy enough to avoid anything serious. I just needed him out of the way long enough to expose the affair and unravel their little plans. But here's the thing, I didn't feel any satisfaction from it. In fact, I felt almost nothing. The revenge that had fueled me for weeks now seemed empty, hollow. Jason was free, Melanie was gone, and I was left with the quiet aftermath of my own life. It was a strange feeling, one that I hadn't anticipated. I took a deep breath and decided that I needed to move on. The divorce was finalized, and I was now free to start over. But what did that even mean? I had spent years building a life with Melanie, and now, I was standing at the edge of a new beginning, unsure of where to go next. Slowly, I began to rebuild. I threw myself into my work, taking on more projects and finding solace in the structure of my career. I spent weekends hiking and mountain biking, rediscovering the outdoor activities I had once loved so much. I reconnected with old friends, people I had drifted away from during my marriage. And yet, there was still an emptiness that lingered, a quiet sadness that settled into the corners of my life. I had been betrayed by the one person I thought I could trust more than anyone. It was a wound that would take time to heal. One day, about a year after Melanie had left, I received a message from her out of the blue. She wanted to meet, to talk things over. I hesitated for a long time before agreeing, curious about what she could possibly have to say. We met at a small cafe, and when she walked in, I barely recognized her. She looked thinner, more fragile, as though the weight of everything had finally taken its toll. She smiled weakly when she saw me, but I didn't return it. "Thank you for meeting me," she said quietly as she sat down. I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I just wanted to apologize," she said, her voice shaky. "For everything. I was selfish, and I hurt you in ways I can never take back. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. There was a time when hearing her apologize would have meant everything to me, but now, it felt too late. Too much had happened. Too much had been lost. "I appreciate that," I said finally, my voice steady. "But we can't undo what's been done. I've moved on, and I think you should too." She looked down at her hands, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just want you to know that I did love you," she whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen." I didn't respond. What was there to say? I had heard all the words before, but they didn't change the past. As I stood up to leave, I glanced at her one last time. "Take care of yourself, Melanie," I said softly. "I hope you find what you're looking for." With that, I walked out of the cafe and didn't look back. In the years that followed, I continued to rebuild my life, piece by piece. There were days when I still thought about Melanie and what we had once shared, but they grew fewer and farther between. I had learned a hard lesson, one that would stay with me for the rest of my life. How strange and incomprehensible this world is. The deepest pain is inflicted by those closest to you, while a helping hand comes from those you least expect. In the end, I found peace in knowing that I had taken control of my life again. I had been betrayed, but I hadn't let it destroy me. And as I moved forward, I knew that I was stronger for it. After leaving the cafe, I felt a strange mixture of relief and finality. The chapter with Melanie was officially closed. There was no anger left, no unresolved questions hanging in the air, just the quiet acceptance that life had moved on. I had moved on. The next few months were transformative. Without the emotional weight of the past holding me down, I found myself more focused on the present, on building a future that was entirely mine. I dove deeper into my work, and before long, an opportunity arose that changed everything. My boss approached me one morning with a proposal. He wanted me to lead a new branch of the company they were planning to open in Denver. It was a major career move, one that came with a significant promotion and the chance to start fresh in a new city. I didn't hesitate. I accepted the offer, packed up my life, and within 2 months, I was standing in the crisp, mountain air of Colorado, ready to begin the next phase of my life. The move to Denver was more than just a career shift, it was a personal reset. The clean slate I had been searching for. My new position kept me busy, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to anyone else. The weight of the past felt lighter with each passing day. Weekends became a time for exploring the outdoors. The Rockies were practically in my backyard, and I found solace in hiking alone, the quiet of the mountains offering me a space to reflect and heal. I would spend hours climbing trails, breathing in the crisp air, and letting go of the anger and pain that had once consumed me. One afternoon, after a long hike, I sat on a rock overlooking a valley, the sun setting in the distance. It was one of those moments that felt almost cinematic, like the world was offering me a gift of clarity. I thought back to everything that had happened, from the betrayal to the revenge, and I realized something profound: I didn't need closure from Melanie anymore. I didn't need to know why she had strayed, or what had driven her to betray me. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had found my way through the storm, and I was stronger because of it. The person I had become, standing there in the cool mountain air, was someone I respected. Someone who had faced the worst and come out the other side, not unscathed, but wiser. And with that realization, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. Several months passed, and life in Denver became my new normal. Work was thriving, I had built a small but solid group of friends, and I had even started dating again, though nothing too serious. I wasn't looking for anything more than companionship at that point. I was content with the simplicity of my life, free from the complications of love and betrayal. One evening, after a long day at work, I was having drinks with a colleague, Emma, who had quickly become a close friend since my move. We were sitting at a bar downtown, laughing about something that had happened in the office when Emma turned to me with a curious look on her face. "You've been here for a while now," she said, swirling her drink. "But I've noticed you never really talk about your past. What's your story?" I paused, taken aback by the question. I hadn't thought much about sharing that part of my life with anyone here in Denver. It felt like a different life, one that no longer defined me. But as I looked at Emma, I realized that maybe, for the first time in a long time, I was ready to talk about it. "You really want to know?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. She nodded, her eyes filled with genuine curiosity. So, I told her. I told her about Melanie, about the betrayal, the affair, and the calculated revenge I had orchestrated to expose everything. I told her about how it had changed me, and how I had moved across the country to start over. When I finished, there was a long silence. Emma didn't look at me with pity or judgment, just quiet understanding. "Wow," she said softly, taking a sip of her drink. "That's a hell of a story." "Yeah," I agreed, feeling a strange sense of release in having told it. "It was." "And now?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Do you regret it? The revenge, I mean." I thought about it for a moment. There was a time when I might have said yes, when the emptiness of revenge left me questioning whether it had been worth it. But now, sitting there with Emma, I knew the answer had changed. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. I needed to do it to move on. But it's not who I am anymore." Emma smiled, and we raised our glasses in a quiet toast. It felt like a symbolic moment, a closing of the final chapter of that part of my life. As the months turned into years, I settled into a life that was finally mine. My career flourished, and I found joy in the little things again: weekend hikes, dinners with friends, quiet evenings at home. The wounds of the past had healed, leaving scars, yes, but they no longer ached. And then, one evening, out of the blue, I received a letter. It was from Melanie. My heart skipped a beat as I opened the envelope, unsure of what I was about to read. The letter was short, only a few lines, but they carried the weight of 1,000 words. "Dear James, I've thought about you often over the years, and I want you to know that I'm truly sorry for everything I did. I've been through a lot since we parted ways, and I've realized just how much I lost when I lost you. I hope you're happy now. You deserve to be. Take care, Melanie." I sat there for a long time, staring at the letter. It didn't stir the emotions I thought it would. Instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle that had long since been completed. I had already moved on, long before this letter arrived. In the end, I didn't write back. I didn't need to. The past was the past, and my future was already waiting for me, just over the next mountain ridge. As I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, I smiled to myself. I had come a long way from that day when I first discovered Melanie's betrayal. And now, standing at the edge of a new horizon, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next. A few weeks after receiving Melanie's letter, I found myself reflecting less on the past and more on what lay ahead. The letter, in some way, had been a final release, a closure I hadn't even realized I needed. Life had taken a new shape, one that felt more peaceful and aligned with who I had become. One evening, after another long hike through the trails of the Rockies, I returned home feeling more at ease than I had in years. As I sat on my balcony, the cool mountain air brushing against my face, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't haunted by memories of Melanie or the betrayal that had nearly torn me apart. It felt like I had truly left that chapter of my life behind. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. One day, at the office, I was working on a project with Emma, the colleague who had become one of my closest friends since I'd moved to Denver. She was sharp, funny, and easy to talk to, and over time, our conversations had gone from casual to deeply personal. I found myself looking forward to our talks, and something in the air between us had shifted. "Hey, James," she said, leaning against the doorframe of my office. "You got plans for tonight?" I looked up from my computer, intrigued. "Not really." "Why, what's up?" She smiled, her eyes playful. "There's this new restaurant downtown I've been wanting to try, and I figured I'd ask if you wanted to join me." No pressure, of course. For a moment, I hesitated. It wasn't that I wasn't interested, it was that I hadn't seriously considered getting involved with anyone since Melanie. Sure, I had gone on a few dates, but nothing had really clicked. But Emma? She was different. There was something about her that made me feel at ease, and more than that, something that made me feel alive again. "Yeah," I said, returning her smile. "I'd love to." That evening, we met at the restaurant, a cozy little spot tucked away in the heart of downtown. The conversation flowed effortlessly, as it always did with Emma. We talked about everything, work, our shared love of hiking, even some of the crazier stories from our past. But as the night went on, there was something more in the air, an unspoken connection that we both felt but hadn't yet acknowledged. As we finished our meal, Emma leaned forward, her eyes locked on mine. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, intrigued. "What changed for you?" she asked softly. "I mean, since you moved here. You're not the same guy you were when you first arrived." I thought about her question for a moment, taking a sip of my drink. "A lot changed," I admitted. "I think, for a long time, I was stuck in the past, caught up in what happened with Melanie, and everything that came with it. But moving here, starting over, it gave me a chance to find myself again." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And now?" "Now?" I smiled. "Now, I'm just trying to live in the moment." Her eyes sparkled as she smiled back. "Well, here's to living in the moment," she said, raising her glass. We clinked our glasses together, and in that moment, I realized something important. I wasn't just moving on from the past, I was opening myself up to the possibility of a future. And that future, it seemed, might just include Emma. Over the next few months, things between Emma and me began to deepen. We spent more time together, going on hikes, grabbing dinner after work, and slowly but surely, we started to blur the lines between friendship and something more. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't forced. It felt natural, as if the pieces of my life were finally falling into place. For the first time since everything that had happened with Melanie, I felt like I was ready to let someone in again. I wasn't haunted by the past anymore, and though the scars of betrayal were still there, they didn't define me. I had learned to trust again, not just others, but myself. One evening, Emma and I found ourselves on the same hiking trail we had walked many times before, but this time, something felt different. As we reached the summit, the sun setting over the mountains in a blaze of orange and pink, I turned to her. "I think I've been avoiding saying this," I began, my voice steady but unsure of how she'd react. "But I care about you, Emma. More than I thought I could care about anyone again." She smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. I care about you too, James, she said, reaching out to take my hand. I've felt it for a while now. We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of what we had just admitted hanging between us. And then, without another word, I pulled her close, and we kissed. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise, a step forward into whatever was to come next. As Emma and I continued to build something together, I realized that my life had come full circle. The pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it had all led me to this moment. And while I could never forget the lessons I had learned, I had finally found peace in knowing that I had moved on. I had rebuilt my life, and now, I was ready to share it with someone who truly cared about me. Looking back, it was clear how far I had come. Melanie and her betrayal were no longer the center of my story. My life had taken on new meaning, one that was focused on the future rather than the past. And as I stood on that mountaintop, with Emma by my side, I knew one thing for sure, I was exactly where I was meant to be. As Emma and I descended from the mountaintop that evening, hand in hand, I couldn't help but feel a sense of completeness. The journey that had started in chaos and heartbreak had somehow brought me here, to a place of peace, love, and new beginnings. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't defined by my past, by the betrayal, or by the bitterness I once carried. Life with Emma felt easy, unburdened by the complications that had haunted my marriage to Melanie. We didn't rush into anything, letting things evolve naturally. We shared the same love for the outdoors, the same appreciation for simplicity, and most importantly, we shared an honesty that was refreshing. There were no secrets, no hidden agendas, just us, enjoying each other's company, building something genuine. One evening, several months after that first hike where we confessed our feelings, Emma and I found ourselves cooking dinner together at her apartment. The atmosphere was warm and cozy, the scent of freshly chopped garlic and herbs filling the air. We had developed a little routine, she handled the chopping, and I took over the cooking. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Emma asked as she handed me the cutting board, her eyes glancing up at me with curiosity. I stirred the vegetables in the pan, smiling at her question. "What do you mean? For us?" She nodded, leaning against the counter, her arms folded comfortably. "Yeah. I mean, things are great the way they are, but I don't know. Do you ever think about what the future holds?" I paused, letting her words sink in. The truth was, I had thought about the future, more than once. And while I had been hesitant at first, not wanting to rush into anything, I knew deep down that what we had was real. It was different from anything I had experienced before. Emma wasn't just someone I cared about, she was someone I could see a future with. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady as I met her gaze. "I think about it all the time." Her smile widened, and she stepped closer, slipping her arms around my waist as I continued to stir the pan. "So, what do you see?" I turned off the stove and set the spatula down, turning to face her fully. "I see us," I said softly. "I see us continuing this, growing together. I'm not in a rush, but I'm not afraid of the future anymore, Emma. Not with you." Her eyes softened, and she stood on her toes to kiss me gently. "Good," she whispered. "Because I feel the same way." The months that followed were some of the happiest I had experienced in a long time. Emma and I continued to build our life together, and with each passing day, I felt more grounded, more secure in who I had become. The anger and bitterness I once felt had faded, replaced by a sense of gratitude for the path I had taken, even if it had been difficult. One day, as Emma and I were preparing for a weekend getaway to a cabin in the mountains, she surprised me with a question that took me off guard. "James, do you ever hear from Melanie?" she asked, her voice casual as she zipped up her overnight bag. I hadn't thought about Melanie in a long time, not since that final letter she had sent. "No, not anymore," I replied, glancing up from my own packing. "The last I heard from her was that letter I told you about." "Why do you ask?" Emma shrugged, a small smile on her lips. "I was just curious. You never talk about her anymore. I paused, realizing that she was right. For so long, Melanie had occupied such a large space in my mind, and now, she was nothing more than a distant memory. I guess I don't need to talk about her anymore, I said thoughtfully. She's part of the past, and I've moved on. Emma nodded, her smile growing warmer. I'm glad. You deserve that. I smiled back, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. Emma was right, I had finally moved on. The chapter with Melanie was well and truly closed, and my future, whatever it held, was no longer tied to the pain of the past. That weekend at the cabin felt like a turning point. Nestled in the quiet embrace of the mountains, Emma and I spent our days hiking through the dense pine forests, enjoying the crisp air and the beauty of nature all around us. At night, we would sit by the fire, sharing stories, laughing, and simply enjoying each other's presence. On the final evening of our trip, as we sat outside on the deck, wrapped in blankets and watching the stars twinkle overhead, I felt a shift within me. It was subtle, but undeniable, the feeling that I had come full circle, that I was no longer the man who had been broken by betrayal, but someone stronger, someone who had rebuilt his life and found happiness again. As we sat there, Emma resting her head on my shoulder, I realized that this was what I had been searching for all along. Not just love, but peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you've survived the worst and come out the other side stronger for it. I think I'm finally ready, I said quietly, almost to myself. Emma lifted her head, looking up at me with a curious expression. Ready for what? I smiled, pulling her closer. Ready to let the past go completely. Ready to move forward. With you. Her eyes shimmered in the soft glow of the firelight, and she leaned in to kiss me gently. I'm ready too, she whispered, her voice full of warmth and certainty. And in that moment, as we sat together under the stars, I knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful. The next chapter of my life was no longer defined by the pain of betrayal or the bitterness of the past, it was defined by love, by hope, and by the simple joy of being with someone who saw me for who I truly was. In the years that followed, Emma and I built a life that was full of adventure, laughter, and love. We hiked new trails, traveled to new places, and continued to grow together in ways I hadn't thought possible. The scars from my past remained, but they no longer defined me. They were reminders of where I had been, not where I was going. And as I stood on another mountaintop one bright morning, looking out at the endless horizon, I couldn't help but smile. Life had a funny way of working out. What had once felt like the end of everything was now just the beginning of something far greater than I could have imagined. I had found peace, love, and most importantly, I had found myself. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. As the years rolled on, life with Emma felt like a continuous unfolding of happiness. We made new memories together, ones that eclipsed the pain of my past and brought a renewed sense of hope. The cabin trips became our tradition, something we both cherished. Each journey into the mountains felt like a reminder of how far we had come, not just in our relationship, but in my personal journey of healing and self-discovery. One evening, a few years after that first fateful hike where Emma and I had shared our feelings, something unexpected happened. We were once again back at our favorite cabin, enjoying a glass of wine by the fire after a long day of exploring the trails. The air was crisp, the fire crackling softly in the background, and I could feel that same sense of peace washing over me that always seemed to come when we were out there, far away from the world. Do you ever think about the future? Emma asked, her voice soft but steady, echoing the same question she'd asked me years ago when our relationship was still new. This time, though, I knew there was something more behind it. I looked at her, her face glowing in the firelight, and I smiled. I do, I said. And I know exactly what I want. She raised an eyebrow, a playful smile tugging at her lips. Oh. And what's that? I set my glass down and reached for her hand, taking a deep breath. I want a future with you, Emma. I've known it for a while now, but I think I'm finally ready to make it official. Her eyes widened, and she looked at me with a mixture of surprise and emotion. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. I had been carrying it with me for weeks, waiting for the right moment, and somehow, this felt like it. "I've thought about this a lot," I said, my voice steady despite the flood of emotions swirling inside me. "You've been with me through so much, Emma. You helped me heal, you gave me hope when I thought I couldn't move forward, and you've been the greatest joy in my life. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." I opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked from the ring to me, her hand trembling slightly in mine. "Emma," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "will you marry me?" For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The crackling of the fire, the cool night air, the soft rustling of the trees, all of it faded as I waited for her response. Then, without hesitation, she smiled through her tears and nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, James, I will." The wave of relief and joy that washed over me was overwhelming. I slipped the ring onto her finger, and she pulled me into a tight embrace, her face buried in my chest as she laughed and cried at the same time. It felt like the culmination of everything we had been through together, the final step in a journey that had begun with heartbreak and betrayal but had led me to something infinitely better. We spent the rest of the evening wrapped in each other's arms, talking about the future, dreaming about the life we would build together. The weight of the past had completely lifted, replaced by the excitement of what was to come. For the first time, I didn't just feel like I had moved on, I felt like I had truly started over, with someone who loved me for who I was, flaws and all. The wedding was small, intimate, and exactly what we wanted. We held it in a clearing in the mountains, surrounded by close friends and family, with the peaks of the Rockies as our backdrop. Emma was breathtaking in a simple white dress, her eyes sparkling with happiness as she walked toward me. I stood there, waiting for her, unable to stop smiling as I thought about how lucky I was to have found her. As the ceremony began, I couldn't help but think back to everything that had led me to this moment. All the pain, the betrayal, the bitterness, it all seemed like a distant memory now, something that had once held me down but had eventually set me free. Standing there with Emma, I realized that the hardest parts of my journey had ultimately led me to the greatest happiness I had ever known. We exchanged our vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever life threw our way. And as I slid the ring onto her finger, I knew in my heart that this was exactly where I was meant to be. The years that followed were filled with the kind of happiness I had never thought possible. Emma and I built a life that was full of love, laughter, and adventure. We traveled to places we had always dreamed of visiting, hiked new trails, and eventually, we bought a small cabin of our own in the mountains, a place that became our sanctuary, a reminder of the journey we had taken together. There were challenges, of course, as there always are in life. But no matter what came our way, we faced it together, with the same sense of honesty and openness that had always been at the core of our relationship. One day, a few years after our wedding, as we sat on the porch of our cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains, Emma turned to me with a soft smile. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked. I smiled, leaning back in my chair and taking her hand. "All the time," I said. "It feels like a lifetime ago." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the sunset. "Do you ever regret anything?" I shook my head. "No," I said, my voice filled with certainty. "Not anymore. Everything that happened led me here, to you. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." Emma squeezed my hand, her smile growing wider. "I feel the same way." As we sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that my life had come full circle. The man I had been, the one who had been betrayed, who had been filled with anger and bitterness, was gone. In his place was someone who had found peace, love, and a future worth living for. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, I knew that I had finally found everything I had ever been searching for. The journey had been long, and at times, unbearably painful. But in the end, it had brought me here, to a life filled with love, happiness, and the knowledge that no matter what, I had the strength to move forward. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. As the years passed, life with Emma continued to evolve, deepening with each shared moment and new adventure. Our cabin in the mountains became our home base, a place where we could retreat from the world and reconnect with the simplicity that had always grounded us. We spent countless weekends there, sipping coffee on the porch as the sun rose, or sitting by the fire in the evening, talking about everything from the mundane details of our workday to the bigger dreams we still held for the future. One evening, as we sat on the porch with blankets wrapped around us, watching the stars shimmer against the dark sky, Emma turned to me with a thoughtful look. "You ever think about starting a family?" she asked softly, her voice barely breaking the peaceful silence of the night. The question didn't catch me off guard. It was something we had talked about casually before, but there was a certain weight in the way she asked it this time. I could tell she wasn't just curious. She was serious. I leaned back in my chair, considering her question. "I do," I said after a pause. "I think about it more and more, actually." She smiled, her eyes reflecting the light of the moon. "Me too." We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, the idea of starting a family settling between us like a promise yet to be fulfilled. It wasn't something we needed to rush into, but knowing that we were on the same page brought a new sense of excitement to the life we were already building together. A few months later, we decided we were ready. The journey to parenthood wasn't an easy one. Like many things in life, it came with its own set of challenges. There were moments of doubt, times when we worried if it would ever happen for us. But through it all, Emma and I stood by each other, supporting one another with the same unwavering love and patience that had defined our relationship from the beginning. And then, one bright morning, after months of waiting and hoping, we received the news we had been longing for. Emma was pregnant. I still remember the way she looked when she told me, her eyes wide with joy and disbelief, her hands trembling slightly as she held the positive test in front of me. I could hardly contain my own excitement as I pulled her into my arms, overwhelmed by the reality of it all. We were going to be parents. The months that followed were filled with anticipation and preparation. We transformed one of the rooms in our house into a nursery, painting the walls a soft, calming blue and filling the space with little touches of warmth and love. Every day brought new conversations about what kind of parents we wanted to be, what we hoped for our child, and how we would navigate this next phase of life together. And then, on a quiet autumn morning, our daughter was born. The moment I held her in my arms for the first time, something inside me shifted. It was as if every hardship I had ever endured, every moment of pain or heartbreak, had led me to this. She was tiny, fragile, and perfect in every way. As she blinked up at me with wide, curious eyes, I felt an overwhelming sense of love and responsibility wash over me. Emma looked over at me from her hospital bed, exhausted but glowing with happiness. "What do you think, James? Are you ready for this?" I smiled, tears filling my eyes as I looked at our daughter. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." We named her Lily, after the wildflowers that grew along the trails we loved to hike. From the moment she entered our lives, she brought with her a joy I had never known, a deep sense of purpose that filled every corner of our days. Being a father changed me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I found myself thinking back to my own journey, to all the lessons I had learned along the way, and how they had prepared me for this new chapter. I wanted to give Lily a life filled with love, honesty, and the sense of security I had once sought for myself. As the years went by, our little family grew closer and stronger. Emma and I continued to nurture our relationship, finding ways to keep the spark alive even as the demands of parenthood took up more of our time. We made space for each other, for our individual passions, and for the love we had built together. And in the midst of it all, we watched as Lily blossomed into a curious, adventurous little girl who shared our love for the outdoors and the quiet beauty of nature. I often took her on hikes, just as Emma and I had done so many times before. Watching her explore the world with wide-eyed wonder reminded me of the importance of those simple moments, the ones where life slows down, and you realize how lucky you are to be exactly where you are. One day, as we were hiking along a familiar trail, Lily, now 5 years old, looked up at me with her bright, inquisitive eyes. "Daddy," she said, her voice filled with that innocent curiosity only children possess. "How did you and Mommy meet?" I smiled, crouching down beside her and taking her little hand in mine. "It's a long story, Lily," I said, my voice soft with the weight of memory. She giggled. "Tell me. I wanna know." And so, as we walked together along the trail, I began to tell her the story of how I had found my way to Emma. I left out the painful parts, of course, those were lessons for another time. Instead, I focused on the beauty of the journey, the moments of joy and discovery that had ultimately brought us together. I told her about the mountains, about the hikes we took, and about how love has a way of finding you when you least expect it. By the time we reached the summit, Lily was beaming with excitement. "That's a good story, Daddy," she said, her little hand still holding mine tightly. I smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle over me. "It is, Lily," I agreed. "It's the best story I know." As I stood there on that mountaintop, with my daughter by my side and Emma waiting for us back at the cabin, I couldn't help but reflect on how far life had brought me. The man I had once been, the one who had been consumed by anger and betrayal, felt like a distant memory. In his place stood someone who had learned the true meaning of love, resilience, and family. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. Because in the end, I had found something far greater than I ever could have imagined. I had found home. And as the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden light over the world below, I knew that my story, our story, was just beginning. Years passed, and the rhythm of our lives settled into something steady and beautiful. Emma and I, now parents to not just Lily but also to our son Ethan, found our days full of laughter, challenges, and endless love. The cabin in the mountains remained our sanctuary, a place where we could escape the rush of everyday life and reconnect with each other and with nature. As Lily and Ethan grew, I watched them with a sense of wonder. They were both so full of life, so curious and unburdened by the complexities of the world. Lily, with her adventurous spirit, was always the first to suggest a hike, eager to explore new trails and discover hidden paths in the woods. Ethan, though younger, was just as eager, following in his big sister's footsteps with a determination that always made me smile. Parenthood brought its own challenges, of course. There were sleepless nights, endless questions, and moments where Emma and I would collapse onto the couch at the end of the day, utterly exhausted but fulfilled in a way that words couldn't describe. But through it all, we leaned on each other, just as we always had. One autumn evening, as the kids were playing in the yard, I sat on the porch with Emma, watching them chase each other through the leaves. The golden light of the setting sun bathed everything in warmth, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the life we had built together. "Can you believe how fast time is flying?" Emma said, her voice soft and reflective. I glanced at her, seeing the same wonder in her eyes that I felt. "It's crazy," I agreed. "It feels like just yesterday we were sitting here, talking about starting a family." She smiled, resting her head on my shoulder. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" I nodded, wrapping my arm around her and pulling her close. "We have," I said, my voice filled with emotion. "And I wouldn't change a single thing." We sat there in comfortable silence, watching our children as they laughed and played, their joy infectious and pure. In that moment, I felt the weight of the years lift off me, replaced by a deep sense of peace. This was what I had always been searching for, a life built on love, trust, and the small, beautiful moments that made everything worthwhile. As Lily and Ethan grew older, they began to ask more questions about life, about the world, and about our past. One evening, as we gathered around the dinner table, Lily, now 10, looked at me with her wide, inquisitive eyes. "Dad, do you think everything happens for a reason?" she asked, her tone serious for someone so young. The question caught me off guard, and I set my fork down, considering her words. I glanced at Emma, who smiled softly, giving me the space to answer. "I think so," I said after a moment. "Sometimes, life doesn't make sense when you're going through something hard. But looking back, you can often see how everything fits together, even the difficult parts." Lily frowned thoughtfully, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Like when bad things happen, but then something good comes out of it?" I nodded, smiling at her perceptiveness. "Exactly," I said. "Sometimes, the hardest moments in life lead us to the best ones. It's not always easy to see at the time, but when you look back, you realize that everything brought you to where you're supposed to be." She seemed to think about that for a while, then nodded slowly, satisfied with the answer. Ethan, who was too young to fully understand the conversation, was already back to playing with his food, much to Emma's amusement. After dinner, as we tucked the kids into bed, I found myself thinking back on Lily's question. It was a simple question, one that kids often ask, but it struck me deeply. I thought about my own life, about the twists and turns that had led me to where I was now. There had been times when I didn't know if I would ever find happiness again, moments of betrayal, anger, and loss that had once consumed me. But looking back now, I could see it clearly. Every step, every painful moment, had brought me here, to this life I had built with Emma and our children. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was mine, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. One afternoon, a few years later, I received a phone call that I hadn't expected. It was Melanie. Her voice was tentative, and there was a long pause before she spoke. "James, I'm sorry to call out of the blue. I just wanted to talk." I sat there for a moment, caught off guard by the flood of emotions her voice brought back. It had been years since we had spoken, years since I had let go of the anger and resentment I once held toward her. But now, hearing her voice, I realized I felt none of that. There was no bitterness, no pain, only a quiet understanding. "What's going on, Melanie?" I asked, keeping my tone calm and neutral. She hesitated before continuing. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About the past, about everything I did to you. I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. Truly sorry." I leaned back in my chair, processing her words. "It's been a long time," I said gently. "I've moved on." "I know," she replied quickly. "And I'm glad. You deserve that. I needed you to know that I regret how everything ended. I wasn't the person I should have been, and I've spent years trying to come to terms with that." I could hear the emotion in her voice, and for a moment, I thought about how different my life might have been if things hadn't fallen apart between us. But as I looked out the window at Emma and the kids playing in the yard, I felt nothing but gratitude for how things had turned out. "I appreciate that, Melanie," I said after a pause. "I hope you found peace with everything." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she spoke again. "I'm trying," she said quietly. "I just wanted to say goodbye, I guess." "Goodbye, Melanie," I said softly, and with that, the call ended. After the phone call, I stood by the window for a long time, watching Emma, Lily, and Ethan as they played outside. I felt a deep sense of closure wash over me, one that I hadn't even realized I needed. The chapter with Melanie was well and truly over, and for the first time, I felt nothing but peace when I thought about her. No more regrets, no more what-ifs. Just the quiet understanding that life had moved on, and so had I. I stepped outside, joining my family in the yard. Emma looked up at me with a smile, her eyes filled with the warmth and love that had sustained me through so much. "Everything okay?" she asked, sensing that something was on my mind. I nodded, pulling her close and watching as Lily and Ethan ran through the grass, their laughter filling the air. "Everything's perfect," I said, kissing her on the forehead. And in that moment, I knew it was true. Life had brought me through so many twists and turns, but in the end, it had led me here, to the family I had always dreamed of, to a life filled with love and laughter. The journey had been long and difficult, but standing there with my wife and children, I knew that every step had been worth it. I had found my way home, and there was no place in the world I would rather be. The years continued to pass, and life settled into a pattern of contentment. Emma, Lily, Ethan, and I grew together as a family, weathering life's ups and downs with the same love and resilience that had defined our relationship from the beginning. The small joys of daily life, family dinners, helping the kids with their homework, or even just sitting by the fire on a quiet evening, became the foundation of the happiness I had found. Lily was now a teenager, full of curiosity and a quiet determination that reminded me of Emma. She had inherited her mother's love for adventure and my deep sense of introspection. Often, I would find her sitting on the porch or in the cabin's living room, reading or scribbling away in her journal, lost in her thoughts. Ethan, always more energetic and mischievous, followed his big sister's lead but had his own way of interpreting the world. He was a force of energy, always asking questions, exploring the world with wide-eyed wonder. He was the kind of kid who would sneak out to camp under the stars in the yard, building forts and making grand plans for the future. One particular weekend, as we packed the car for another family trip to the mountains, I felt a sense of nostalgia settle over me. I watched as Lily and Ethan loaded their backpacks with their usual essentials, books, hiking gear, snacks, and I couldn't help but reflect on how far we had all come. "Dad," Lily said, breaking me from my thoughts. "You're staring off into space again." I smiled, shaking my head. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked, her tone curious. I glanced at Emma, who was helping Ethan tie his shoes, and then back at Lily. "About how fast time is flying by. You and your brother are growing up so fast." Lily rolled her eyes, though her smile softened the gesture. "Don't get all sentimental on me, Dad." I chuckled. "I can't help it. One day, you'll understand." Lily didn't reply, but the thoughtful look in her eyes told me she was already beginning to understand. She was on the cusp of adulthood, and with each passing day, I saw glimpses of the strong, capable woman she would one day become. That weekend in the mountains felt like something out of a dream. The air was crisp and cool, the leaves on the trees turning shades of gold and red as autumn settled in. We hiked along familiar trails, ones that Emma and I had walked countless times before, now sharing them with our children. It felt as though we were passing on something sacred to them, a connection to the natural world, to the peace that came with being surrounded by the quiet beauty of the mountains. On the last day of our trip, we decided to hike up to a spot Emma and I had discovered years ago, a secluded ridge with a breathtaking view of the valley below. As we reached the summit, the sight of the vast, open landscape stretching out before us took my breath away, just as it had the first time I had seen it. We sat down on a large rock, taking in the view. Lily and Ethan wandered off a bit, exploring the area while Emma and I sat together, watching them with quiet smiles. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Emma said softly, leaning her head on my shoulder. I nodded, wrapping my arm around her. "It always is." For a while, we sat there in comfortable silence, the wind gently rustling through the trees, the vastness of the world around us making everything else seem small in comparison. I found myself thinking back to all the moments that had led me here, every decision, every hardship, every triumph. It all felt like part of a larger story, one that had brought me to this place, to this life. After a while, Lily and Ethan returned, their cheeks flushed from the cool air and the excitement of their exploration. "Dad, look at this." Ethan called out, holding up a smooth, flat stone he had found near the edge of the ridge. "Isn't it cool?" I smiled, nodding. "That's a great find, Bud." He beamed, slipping the stone into his backpack as Lily rolled her eyes affectionately. "You've officially become a rock collector," she teased, though her smile betrayed her amusement. As we sat together, watching the sun begin to dip toward the horizon, Lily turned to me with a more serious expression. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, curious about the tone in her voice. She hesitated for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. "Do you ever think about what your life would be like if things hadn't happened the way they did? If you and Mom hadn't met, or if things had turned out differently?" Her question took me by surprise, but it didn't unsettle me the way it once might have. I glanced at Emma, who smiled softly at me, her eyes full of understanding. "I used to think about that a lot," I admitted, my voice calm. "There was a time when I wondered about all the what-ifs. But as I got older, I realized something important: everything that happened, good and bad, brought me here. And I wouldn't change a single thing." Lily nodded slowly, her thoughtful expression deepening. "I guess that's part of growing up, huh? Realizing that everything happens for a reason." I smiled, feeling a sense of pride in how much she was growing, not just physically but emotionally. "Yeah," I said softly. "It is." We sat there for a while longer, the four of us together on that quiet ridge, watching the sun sink lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the valley below. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. Life, with all its twists and turns, had led me here, to this perfect moment with my family. I realized then that it wasn't just the big events, the betrayals, the losses, the triumphs, that defined a life. It was the small, seemingly insignificant moments like this, sitting on a mountain with the people you loved, that gave life its true meaning. As the years continued to roll by, Lily and Ethan grew into young adults, each following their own path with the same sense of adventure and curiosity that had always defined them. Emma and I watched with pride as they blossomed into the people we had always known they could be: strong, kind, and ready to face whatever life threw their way. We continued to return to the mountains, year after year, always finding new trails to explore, new places to discover. And with each visit, I was reminded of how far we had all come, of the journey we had taken together. One evening, after a particularly long hike, Emma and I sat on the porch of our cabin, watching the stars twinkle overhead. The kids were inside, laughing and playing a board game, their voices a comforting sound in the quiet of the night. "You know," I said, turning to Emma, "I think this is it. This is the life I always dreamed of." She smiled, reaching for my hand. "I think so too." And as we sat there, surrounded by the people we loved and the beauty of the mountains, I knew that no matter where life took us next, we would face it together. The past no longer held any power over me. The future was wide open, full of possibilities, and I was ready to embrace it all. Because in the end, it wasn't just about the destination, it was about the journey. And this journey, with Emma, Lily, Ethan, and all the love and laughter that filled our days, was the greatest adventure of all.